This week in the Psychology of Education, Culture and Context. We'll examine what educational psychologists mean by the terms culture and context, and take a look at one particularly influential theory, known as bioecological systems theory. On your own, you'll read a chapter about culture and context from the report How People Learn, and read about 2 examples of teaching that account for students' culture and context in the classroom, reality pedagogy, and an approach in New York City schools aimed at integrating classrooms for students with and without autism. Let's get started. So, what do educational researchers mean by the terms culture and context? These are likely terms that you are familiar with or have heard in your daily life. There are a lot of different definitions. But when we're thinking about culture, educational psychologists typically are referring to learned behaviors of a group of people that generally reflect the tradition of the people and is socially transmitted from generation to generation through social learning. Individuals both make up a culture, and so the culture includes the behaviors of the group members, but culture also includes social interaction. Culture is positioned within a socio-historical time. It includes things like values, beliefs, knowledge, norms, practices, physical objects. Those all can be part of the culture. In terms of education and learning, we often think about the culture of classrooms. How are children expected to act? How are they expected to dress or interact with the teacher? How do they interact with the peers? What knowledge and skills are deemed valuable to deserve time in the curriculum? What's included in the textbooks? What knowledge is worthy of being tested on exams? These are all components and parts of the classroom culture. When I think about the word context, I think about it as overlapping in part with the term culture. We can define context as the features of an environment or the individual's position within the environment. So it's not just environmental features, but the relation between the individual and the environment. This can include social, emotional, motivational, cognitive, developmental, biological, and temporal aspects, as well as more. I bet you could come up with a few other examples by the time we end this. However, the term context also includes this aspect of the child in relation to the environment. This is really important. For instance, if I say developmental context of learning, what I'm referring to are the features of the environment related to the age or grade level appropriateness for a specific child. There's not just a general developmental context. Is that context, is that classroom, are the settings appropriate developmentally for one specific child? The developmental context that's appropriate for a 3rd grader who's typically developing might look really different from an appropriate developmental context for a 3rd grader with autism, or the developmental context that's appropriate for a 9th grader. To think more about the social, emotional, motivational, cognitive, developmental, biological, and temporal aspects of context, let's consider these children sitting on beanbag chairs, huddled in pairs, learning over their iPads. There's a social context here. Students are working together, and that may or may not align with the cultural practices students experience in their homes. We can consider the emotional context. Is what they're working on bringing up feelings of anxiety, confusion, excitement, interest, curiosity? What is the emotional context surrounding this learning? The motivational context. How do students' interests, their values, their beliefs in their own ability, for instance, interact with what they're learning and how they're learning? Does the activity trigger feelings of confidence because they're working on things that in the US culture or their classroom culture has led them to believe they should be good at? Or does learning about this specific thing in this way, in this moment in time, lead to feelings of boredom or inadequacy? And we see this, for instance, the motivational context of women learning in science. It may be really different than a male student who's taking the same class due to cultural settings of a deemed appropriateness of who belongs within a science class. In terms of cognitive context, is the challenge of the assignment matched to the student's ability? Is it too easy? Is it too difficult? Again, this is going to be very different for every single student. There is not one context. The context involves an interaction between the individual and the environment. To bring this perhaps even more closer to home, when AU announced their change to the AU Forward plan this past summer, the switch from hybrid to completely online, the physical context of our learning environments changed. So there was a change in physical context, but this shift in context wasn't just about the physical space where we would learn. It involved social components, emotional components, motivational components. And your specific context for learning as a result of this change is not the same as anybody else's context. Because even if some aspects of the context are the same, the fact that we're all in line, you all have your own position within this context. One theory that's been particularly influential in thinking within the educational research and developmental psychology realms is something called bioecological systems theory. A little bit of a mouthful. To break this down, this is a theory that comes from a scholar named Urie Bronfenbrenner. When we talk about bio, in this case, it's short for biopsychosocial, or the biological, psychological, and social elements. Ecological refers to the interaction between an individual and their surrounding environment. Now, let's take a look at what this looks like. So, at the center is the student. It could be a teacher, it could be you, it could be me, it could be anyone, any one specific person at one specific moment in time. Keep this in mind, that this context of learning is shifting at every moment. So this student has certain biopsychosocial factors. So they have biological characteristics, they have psychological characteristics, they have social characteristics, such as traits, dispositions, personality, ability, prior knowledge, interest, sociability, language, all of these things that are characteristics about you. These change and shift over time and over development. And according to bioecological systems theory, the development of these individual characteristics is really the purpose of education and learning. We're developing biological, psychological, social characteristics of individuals that are situated within an environment. Now, in terms of the ecology, there's a variety of rings that kind of extend out around an individual. So in this case, I'm only drawing two: a microsystem, what is physically in your environment right now. And keep in mind, so this was developed pre-internet age. So our microsystem includes a lot of physical aspects and resources available online, as well as all the physical things and people in our environment. So this microsystem might include things like a student's parents, teachers, peers. As people, might also include the activities, the specific textbooks that are assigned, the technology they have to work with, etc. All of this microsystem is embedded within a macro system, things like the culture. This could be the culture of this sort of school. This could be the sort of predominant culture of the US, educational policies, economy, social attitudes. Maybe we consider how this has shifted. Some of these things have shifted so much over the past 6 months. Now, within all these layers, there are relations. So this theory says everything is interrelated around the student. So there's all these layers. We could imagine that there are probably layers between sort of this micro level and macro level. For ease of illustration, I've just drawn those two layers. But the student interacts with the elements of its microsystem. She might interact with her teachers or her peers. She uses the books, uses the technology. The teacher influences the student influences the teacher, etc. This is a bi-directional relationship. So, for instance, the environment here can directly impact the individual. A teacher may directly influence the student, if it's a really excellent teacher, for instance, maybe one example, or the student can influence the parents. For instance, if the student expresses a really strong interest in learning about dinosaurs, maybe the parent then goes to the library and checks out some books about that topic. There's also bidirectional relationships between the micro and macro system, between the levels within the microsystem. So this theory, bioecological systems theory, essentially says that everything is interrelated. So the economy may affect what technology is available. Educational policies may influence a teacher's behaviors in the classrooms. The culture, the predominant culture, may influence teachers. The teacher's home culture may influence them, which then has impacts on the students. So as you're going about your week and as you're reading the materials for this week, I encourage you to think about what is in your microsystem at any given moment. What is the macro system that's shaping and influencing your microsystem and setting this context for your microsystem?